Bruno, what do you notice about Dima's, like that's maybe different than yours, or anything at all besides it being pretty?
Let's see. LocalDB, CloudDB, Kafka, snapshot. So it seems to me that mostly, I don't know if there is like more to it, but it seems that it was a higher level design than what I did. It's definitely different. It's talking about snapshots, which I didn't really mention, but I don't know what is a snapshot in the context here. So like I can't say right away. So yeah, so I guess we are going to like, just looking at the design, at least to me, it's not like very clear what exactly is being mentioned here, right? But it's just because like I literally just dropped in a parachute and then like went to see that. But yeah,
Dima, what were the snapshots again?
It's the idea that the API between the interview node and the code execution node, this API doesn't contain the code itself. The code is in the message queue in the form of incremental updates, but because you don't want this node that runs the code to always replay it from scratch to recreate the code, it can create its own snapshots to only append the final deltas. So level 0 thinking would be the left-hand side, the interview service would make an API call to the code execution service, and the semantics would be, hey, here's the code, please run it and tell me what happens. Extremely the results. But then this might work, but I was thinking I can get fancier because the code could be longer. So instead of actually having the API call itself contain the whole body of the text of the source code, since this body is already stored in a replayable storage, which in my case is a Kafka store. In this case, the API semantics could not contain the source code, but just take certain snapshots, certain offset or index of this interview and run the code from there. In which case, the snapshots are just used to not replay the whole thing from scratch every time, but only look at the version at which the whole code was, let's say 15 seconds ago.
Okay, I think the different approach that I took here is just that I basically recompiled and rerun whenever there was like a new, whatever it was requested, right? So my main reasoning behind that was mostly because if I was reusing the actual interface where you talk to things. So basically, when you are in the coding mode, right, which is what we are talking about here, like the entire code is already there, right? So I could potentially like do it in a way similar as you did, but then I would need to explicitly store the code itself in some state, which like the way that you put it, like it actually makes sense because like if I could potentially like go to my recording service and retrieve the actual code that was there and do it, right? I just thought that it was a simpler design to just go and, hey, I have the code here. And like, if you think about it, for these type of interviews, there will never, ever be like hundreds of lines of code, right? There's not even actual time to have that much in during an interview. So my main reason is just like, it's just very little code. So let's just recompile and run it. But yeah.
I'm totally with you. Sorry, I think I was over fancying myself. So my instinct was that imagine somebody wrote like 10 kilobytes of code, and then every single second they add a character and then save, which makes it run. And then again and again and again. I don't want it to be order n squared in RAM and on disk. I only want it to be incremental updates. Okay. I totally agree. It's unnecessary for this problem.
But it's also just a clarification. It's like in my case, there was no explicitly saving step, I would say. It's just that whenever someone hit a compile button, then it would just do and compile that thing, right? Like you get the entire code and then compile it, right? But so I didn't need to worry about these incremental builds. It was not trying to build on the fly. Although if I want to do syntax highlighting, which is probably what you're getting at, then I would need to be compiling every single time. But I kind of waved away syntax highlighting. Well, not syntax highlighting, but like error squiggles, like the marker for errors and all that in runtime. But you still get that when you try to compile, right? So that's mainly why I didn't worry about it. But yeah.
I do want to point out that one of the other key parts of your, just to kind of move forward, but with one of the big differences between your two is Dima handled data loss, where like you have a local database, kind of storing what happens. That way, if there's some issue with sending something to the API or something like that, like we still have a local copy of it. We don't lose data. So it'd be interesting to kind of discuss that. Was that something you thought of, Bruno, when you were going through it, and just didn't really think was super important or relevant, or kind of how would you have handled that?
So it is definitely important. Like I would never wave away anything like that. So my main reasoning was twofold. The first one is that whenever you're typing, right, at some point in time, you're sending, like, as I mentioned, like every half second, if there is new data, then you're going to send it to the session, which forwards it to the recording service, right? So there are two main failure cases here, I think. One is if the browser itself goes down, right? Like for some reason, crash the browser. So you start it again, you connect, and then basically your local session would have to be reconstructed from whatever is recorded, right? Which is, it can be done, right? Like it probably non-ideal here. If we think that this happens a lot, then it's probably non-ideal. If we think this is a rare occurrence, that we might just say that, you know what, like it is possible to recover it. It will be a bit convoluted, but it will work, right? So that is the main thing. The other failure mode would be the driver is okay, the browser is okay, but the actual service goes down. Any component of the service might go down, right? So the idea is that because my delay is only like half a second, right? And the recording service is actually storing the data, which probably I didn't mention at that point there, but the record service is not just keeping it in memory other than like normal caches and things like that. It will actually write, right, to this. So in that case, whenever the service comes up back, it can restore the session in the same way by just replaying the whatever was recorded before, right? There might be a case where a user then will not have the last 1 second of whatever they typed or something like that, which like might be weird, but it's probably not a deal breaker here.
Right,
so
it's acceptable.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I considered that. I just thought that it would not be a very common thing, and that I also thought that whatever I had in place could be extended relatively easy, if not non-ideally, to just recovered sessions, right? But yeah.
In practice, if you want to take it to like level, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just wondering, like, is there a big expense difference between like the snapshots and the Bruno's approach with the session data? I mean, I guess I'm trying to visualize like what does this actually look like in terms of space.
So if I understand it, it should not make much of a difference, right? Like mostly because Dima is storing it's deltas, right? It's not a copy of everything all the time. Even if it was a copy of everything all the time, like it's still text, right? So probably it wouldn't amount to a lot anyway, right? So I think storage, at least Dima, if you do not agree, please go ahead and say that. But it seems to me that it would be more or less in terms of storage, the same thing in that.
I think what you said, which I agree with, and I missed it, and I think that's what Grace was asking about, is you leverage the browser local storage, right?
Yes.
Which is pretty much infinite compared to your, if you're talking about millions of interviews, you can use megabytes of each user's browser space, and that's free for you. Yeah, in which case we have like three layers of safety. One is the browser local storage, the other one is local database, and the third one is a cloud database. That's the question, right, Grace?
That was a better question than mine, but yes, that's definitely related to what I was asking.
I was about to add that if we were to make it a follow-up, like level 6 interview question, these issues, these possible failure modes, they are extremely correlated.
Yes.
So if the assumption that they would be hitting you at random here or there, it's just wrong. In practice, somebody deploys buggy code, and when you type certain keyword like while, your application crashes for every single interviewer. And this is something that is expensive to recover from. That's something to plan for. So that could be an interesting follow-up. I'm kind of glad we didn't get there because it's probably beyond our audience today. But yeah, not you guys, sorry, beyond what we record, beyond who we're recording for. But yeah.
In the chat, we were kind of comparing and contrasting the smack that Dima was talking about at the beginning. He's like, "Oh, interviewing IO, it's designed totally wrong. It's terrible." It's like, what? So
not wrong.
like the
Not wrong.
Oh, there is this comment actually brings me back to something that I will quickly mention it. But like interviewing.io actually use a third-party service for handling audio, right? Like, which is like, of course, it makes sense if you think about it, because it offloads a lot of the work that we would have to do otherwise, right? But on the other hand, interviewing.io is now kind of hostage of that service in a way, right? Because that service like must provide them like some type of SLA at the very minimum and something like that. And one thing, like, because Dima mentioned L6, one huge difference that I think related to system design, when you have an L6 engineer or a more junior engineer, like comparing both, right? Like an L6 engineer must be aware of the impact of his system on whatever they are using, and the other way around too, right? So they need to worry about, for example, oh, am I sending like data in a way that I won't bring down the remote service? And also, can the remote service actually cope with what I need to see? Like, what do I need to do to make it work and all that, right? So these type of worries actually are something that I definitely like. It's very good if I get from other candidates, but if for L6 engineers, I would expect them to actually be aware of this and explicitly mention it, right? Because it is an important part of designing a system correctly, right? Taking into account everything. But yeah,
you hope they mention like service level agreements for third-party services.
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah, in my full defense, I would add that you really tried to make the streamer towards scaling interviewing.io to millions of concurrent interviews. And that's where I derived the most constraint from, because the rest, honestly, does not sound hard to me. If the number of concurrent interviews is in like 5 digits, machines will die. You need to reshuffle them on the fly, and you need to not lose data. That's what I was trying to focus on. Yeah, of course, when in the real life, the number of concurrent interviews is probably single digit, maybe double digits, and you are far more. Your business hours should be spent thinking about dependencies like the ones Bruno is outlining right now, as opposed to like proper high scale, high load design. It's not hypertext trading; it's interviewing.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And in fact, I actually asked about this when I was like gathering like requirements. One of the things that I said, so I assume that like this would have no more than, I say, 100 concurrent sessions happening at the same time, right? It might have lots of sessions during the day, but at the same time, it's unlikely there will be a lot, because like we need one interviewer per session, right? Like that there is a limited number and all that. And I kind of said that I would like discuss then general scaling later, which I only touched, to be frank. But my design, yes, takes into account that generally we are not going to have a lot of sessions. So because of this, it's kind of simpler doing it like this, right? But yeah.
Josh asked a good question. If I had to hire one of you two or both, like who would I pass basically through this? Just to be fully transparent, both of these engineers are like orders of magnitude more senior than I am when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I'd hire both of them, obviously. But it's worthwhile noting that there were key things that they were saying that were like, things that I know because I studied this question, and things that I know that are important for this question. And both of them had specific things that they said that are like, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. So the moment with Dima was CRDT. It's like, okay, great. We don't need to discuss anything about concurrency. You clearly know what you're talking about. Great. The moment with Bruno was sandboxing. It's like, okay, great. So like, clearly you know a lot about this, and we could dive deep in it if we wanted to, but it's like, they're just little moments like that just kind of show up where it's like, this person knows so much about this because they know the exact term to use, and they just throw it off like, oh yeah, we sandbox this and it's done. But there's like a whole layer as to like why we do that's not even being unpacked. So yeah, definitely hire both. Fire me, hire them.
What does the opposite of what Mike just said look like for Bruno or for Dima? Like Mike said, somebody can bring something up and it's very clear, they know exactly what they're talking about, so I move on. What would be the opposite of that you see in candidate behavior that candidates should stop doing because it's like a red flag?
So I can give this a quick go. So I think one of the things kind of related to this that I noticed is that sometimes, it doesn't happen often, but some of the people that I interview, they just start throwing technical terms, like they just start mentioning a lot of things. Like, oh, I could do that, I could do this, I could do that. And the main problem with that is that sometimes they are doing this just because they read somewhere, right? Like basically, yeah, oh, I read this thing somewhere, so I'm going to mention it because I know I'm going to use that. Sometimes, like not always, because sometimes I do exactly this. I basically assume that, yeah, they seem to know what they are doing. So there's nothing to probe here, right? If I go in that direction, I'm not testing knowledge. I'm like, I would be testing like possibly knowledge, but I wouldn't be knowing if that knowledge comes because they are smart in a way, for some definition of smart, or if they just know it by heart, right? Because they read somewhere. So basically, the main problem with that is that most of the time then that I start probing, when they just start throwing technical terms, they don't know how to follow up. So they mention something, and then like I do like a very simple question. Okay, so you just mentioned this. Can you tell me why it fits here? And then they stutter, right? And then they do not move forward. So I think one thing is just like, I know what I'm talking about. So I'm throwing this there because I know if there is a follow-up question, I can just follow with it. But if you're just throwing things that you heard somewhere and you are not able to follow up on that, it's better not to, right? That doesn't help. So, but yeah.
The most obvious one there is brand names of technologies in my head. It's the same for you. Like if somebody says, we should use Cassandra here, is that the most obvious kind of?
Mongo.
Yeah, Mongo, yes. Like sometimes they just said, oh, yeah, this can be used for this. But then you ask, okay, but why, right? And then because I read somewhere that you use the Redis is a very good example, right? Because Redis, you can use it at like 10 different types of things. A very common usage of Redis is as a cache, right? Then a lot of people say that they are going to use Redis as a cache. And then when they describe what's happening, they're using Redis basically as a key value database storage, right? It's not a cache, like it's not making the work of a cache, right? And then that basically just shows that although they know what Redis is, they do not understand what they are doing, right? And again, that will complicate your life because then the interviewer says, okay, let's talk more about this because now I want to know, right? And yeah, but yeah.
Trying to
let's tailor this to our audience, by the way, because I think so. Yeah, everything you're saying is correct. Everything you're saying, I fully agree with. But it's just it doesn't turn yes into a no for an L4 candidate. It would turn yes into a no for an L6 candidate who is probably accept an L5, but nowhere does not go down to L4. I guess in practice, like to answer your question, Kevin, what could make it a sharp cooler for an L4 interview is this arrogance that I know how to do these things. And when I talk to these people, I'm trying to ask them this question in a slightly more like playful way. I'm like, imagine you're a tech lead and one of your team members is suggesting you're going to use this technology, but you know it's wrong. How would you convince them otherwise? So this is kind of forcing them to be slightly more Socratic in their arguments. And honestly, if the person is coachable, I would still hire them as an L4. It's not that it's going to be a no. What would certainly make it a no is if they really hold their grounds firmly with no arguments heard at all.
And just to add a bit to that, there is something that a lot of candidates fail to realize, which is like, so you can't assume this, but it's generally true. Like when someone that is interviewing you, especially for a big company like Google, Facebook, or Meta these days, or Twitter, or whatever, like they probably tried that same question like 100 different times with 100 different people, right? So like, generally speaking, we should know, like as interviewers, the ins and outs of every single question, right? So I always tell the people that I interview, like, pay attention to what your interviewer is telling you, because like it doesn't. If you try to fight what is being told you, like there is no good outcome out of that, right? Because it's very unlikely that you are going to come up with something. It's not impossible, again, to be sure, it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely that you're going to come with a completely novel thing that would never cross the interviewer mind and will be like the right way to do whatever you're doing, right? So unless you are really, really, really extremely confident about what you're saying, you should pay attention to what your interviewer is telling you and like follow suit, because otherwise you're wasting time and your interviewer like will get in an adversarial mode, and then it's not good for anyone during an interview, right? But yeah.
I'm curious, do you always think about the requirements in terms of the user requirements from those using the UI and interacting with it? Because I feel like some of the requirements kind of fell into the role of like, you know, not just the interviewer and the interviewee, but the software engineer and the business manager. And, you know, like, I would be curious, I know we ran out of time, to see more like granular API design. Would you recommend getting into the weeds with that kind of thing in terms of breaking it out into like what information, you know, is actually required by which folks internally, or would you kind of hand wave that? Any thoughts in that general area would be appreciated. Yeah.
Want to give it a go, Jima?
Sure. Yeah. Let's take turns so we can amend to one another's words. So I was always skeptical about functional requirements until I started trying to have a systematic picture in my mind on how to help people with interview prep. And I've distilled a clear wisdom in my head that functional requirements matter, but they don't matter because people expect them. They matter because they help you guide your design later on. Whether they begin from the user or from the business or from the technology, there's no short answer. It depends. I think most companies these days, especially when they hire young, aspiring, talented guys and girls, most companies want you to be user advocate. So you would not go wrong if you begin thinking what the user sees. What if in this fork in my design, I choose A over B? How would it affect the user? If I can articulate a certain design would make users switch to other app, like if my Uber app is too slow at picking the driver, I'm going to switch to Lyft. That's going to give you huge bonus points right away when you interview for Uber, because you're thinking about the user. Now, with this being said, I don't necessarily think there is a clear answer here. And when it comes to API specs, so look, my view is that, again, at high levels, you can almost skip it. But at low levels, it's like your saving hand. If you don't know what to say, talk about the API, because APIs, if you outline your requirements carefully, the API flows from them naturally, much like the database schema. So if you don't know what to say, and you feel like you need to be talking about something, talk about the API spec. Your interview would stop you after a minute or so, but this would not be held against you, as opposed to talking about something like some high order matters, in which case you can dig yourself into a hole.
Okay. No,
just to add to that, like I fully agree what Dima said, and I just want to add that it's very, you do not need to explicitly say, like, go and say, oh, but this is my API and all that, and this is my like database schema, which usually follows directly from the API, right? So if you do one, you cannot sort of, well, just go and do the other. But it is very important to note that you need to at least be able to describe what would pass as an API, right? Here, like we talked about what interactions happen, right? Those interactions are APIs, right? But we are not like giving explicitly name to those.
We talked about the data objects, basically.
Yes, exactly. Because like it's just a formalization of what you're saying. Like in system design, like I always say, like it is a conversation between you and your interviewer, right? So as long as your interviewer understands, has enough information that they can infer whatever you're saying, the interview will most likely be okay. Like no matter if you're actually like writing down a detailed API, or if you just said, yes, no, I have to upload files, I have to download things and whatever. Like these are APIs, right? It's just not formal ones, but yeah.
And to
there's a good trick, right?
Go ahead.
Just one thing. Yeah, there's a good trick. If you're uneasy about talking about the API, but you want to sound super smart, the term you can use these days is contract.
Yes.
You can say we need to establish the contract between these two services, which kind of encompasses the API, database schema, sync, async, Kafka, etc. And then it's not committed. You can always fall back on it. So yeah, if you're not sure about the API, if it's going to be too low level for this particular interviewer in this particular situation, use the word contract instead and see what happens.
Absolutely. I think on the same vein, what level are you interviewing at? You know, if you are an L4 and you're just going to be building APIs, like, yeah, it makes sense to kind of talk about that. But if you're trying for L5 and you're like designing backend systems, you really kind of need to talk about the backend. Who cares what the API looks like? We agree that we're basically sending parameters as a data structure and we're kind of storing it, and nobody cares what the database looks like except the database admin. So if you're being interviewed by a database admin, maybe he'll dive into that, or maybe there's something particularly complex or like something about the data model that makes it difficult. But, in general, like what level are you interviewing for? If you're talking high level, like you should stay more high level and not dive into the very specific writing of code or something. And actually, I would be curious to know what Dima's thought is on writing code in these types of interviews, because I think he has a different opinion on this, which is contrary to everything I've ever heard about this. So I'd love it maybe if you flesh this out more about, like, should you be actually coding in a system design interview? I think you actually said at one point that isn't a bad idea. What are your thoughts, Dima?
So the point is, I think on a sys design interview, writing code is a step down. It's a huge step down. You ideally want to get away with it without it. But if you feel like you don't really know what to say and you just want to pass the interview at L4, you can just put a coder pad there and write a few lines of code as an API spec, and it's going to play to your advantage. It would not make you an L6, but it would increase your chances as an L4. So don't be shy. That's what I would say. Before we go further, there's one thing that I think is worthy of mentioning. I feel like I certainly missed it. I think, Bruno, you glossed over it. But there's one thing that didn't connect. Like, there are two dots that didn't connect in my head. I was just assuming that we could have this syntax highlighter in the editor space, like on the left-hand side of my diagram, so that the browser has some component that highlights the syntax. And it, like, I had it mentally done in my head and I forgot about it. But when it comes to actual, like, deeper level highlights, not syntax, but like variable name and use and stuff like that, you actually need to try to compile the code. You actually need to run some high level stuff. So even though you don't really try to run this code after every single one line change, the good design would try to at least post-process your code using the expensive advanced means of running it at least every couple of seconds. So in fact, there is more communication between the left-hand side and right-hand side of my diagrams, which I totally missed. So yeah, if I'm designing interview in .io, I think it's going to be a killer feature that I'm fully on board with this. That's, like, I'm embarrassed to having missed that. Embarrassed of having missed that.
Well, you should always look at the bright side, right? Because they made us design interviewing.io, it means that now they have to pay us for it. So there you go.
That will be $1 million.
Oh, perfect. That is, yeah, that's fine. Okay, good.
I remember Dima talking about serialization being the ideal choice, but that it was expensive. And I guess I'm trying to think of, like, what would be, in your opinion, this, like, is the snapshot the only other option or that you would recommend, or is there any other common solution to, like, getting the benefits of serialization without the cost of it?
I may have not phrased myself well. So the word serialization has at least three meanings, and one has to do with, like, marshalling, JSON or binary format or whatnot. That's not what I meant. What I meant was
the order, right?
Yeah, the order. So snapshots, it's really hard to snapshot things that cannot be ordered. That's the point. So there's this concept of vector clocks if your time is multidimensional. So if it's a single dimension, for every two events, one happened before the other. They could overlap a bit, but you can always say that the one started before the other one has finished. If they can overlap, they are kind of processed concurrently, and that is really hard to snapshot. So, like, my personal rule of thumb, I might be off, but I'm fairly confident in what I'm saying. You can quote me on that. My rule of thumb is that the world took the wrong for many years ago when we tried to support concurrent transactions in databases. I mean, it was our only choice back in, like, 40 years ago because CPUs were slow. But nowadays, look at Spanner. Spanner gives you what is called external consistency. For every two transactions, you know for a fact which one was processed before the other. There's no concurrency whatsoever. And I think that's the standard to strive for, because even if you could win something by not striving there, you end up with far more convoluted logical designs so that later on somebody could mess it up. So all I was trying to say is that if each single interview has its own time axis, so between every two interviews, there is no correlation. There's no relationship between, like, second 3 of our interview happens before second 5 of some other interview. If it's all in the same, like, time namespace, your snapshots will be heavy and huge. But if it's all in this, if each interview is its own namespace, you have too many snapshots to manage. So I was trying to say that there can be some gold standard of a small-ish number of time axes, and each interview belongs to one and only one of them. And then you build a snapshot for multiple interviews that belong to the same time axis, which would map to a single Kafka partition.
And Brett had a question, which I think is good. He says, how much of your design was based on the requirement that it has to scale? Would you have designed it differently, or do you think it is better to default on building systems as scalable as the default at the risk of over-optimizing too early? So basically just, I think maybe Dima, you can answer for you, and then Bruno, you can answer for yourself.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I mentioned this during the interview part. So I always think you should first solve the problem that you have at hand, which basically you design the system. Like you might make a point of saying, yes, I'm fully aware this will be a distributed system. It will need to scale and all that. But I'm considering each of the boxes that I wrote as a black box type of thing, right? What exactly that represents is a different discussion. Because, for example, the session manager there, it would be like there will be a load balancer, there will be several tasks, there will be an orchestrator and all that. But it's always more important for you to have a working solution than to go over those designs, because the main point is just that if you don't have a working solution by the end of your interview, you did not pass the interview, right? Like you need to at least have something that works, even if it's missing some pieces. But that's the least the least that you should do, right? And you can always expand on this, right? So even if I only like did these drawings with these boxes and all that, I can always then go later and say yes, but of course this all needs to scale. And then like we would have like, it's not a single front end, right? It's a series of front ends with a load balancer. Like everything basically has a load balancer attached to it, right? Or multiple load balancers, depending on the scale. You might even have to like have different levels of load balancers and all that. But the main point is just that scale is always a consideration. Whenever, like, it's like when you're designing a system, if it will be a distributed system. Like even if you could run everything in a single machine, right? And you could put everything there and it would work, and it wouldn't even tax the machine. You don't want that because you need reliability, right? At the very least. So you need to have more than one machine, because if that machine goes down, you don't want everything to stop waiting for everything to come back up again. Hopefully you have a spare that you can just switch to and just continue doing your work, right? So like it will always be a distributed system. The scale varies, but I think the more important part is having a general idea of what you need to do to to get to the scalability that you need. For example, you might need multiple levels of load balancers because you might need to scale the load balancers themselves when you are dealing with like something huge, like something that Google would do, right? But it's also at the same time, it is things that are well known up to a point. So at least for me, if the interviewer indicates that they understand what needs to be done here, right? And they actually make a point of saying, yes, this thing we need to scale. We are going to have an orchestrator just make sure the tests are running, the correct number of tests and all that. Then I might already think that that is enough for this part. But a different interviewer might actually want you to know, no, actually, I want to know, because like, so how many connections can you have on a single machine, right? So let's make the number of machines based on that, right? And then you can look at the number of TCP ports that a machine can take, for example, or whatever thing, or whatever other metric that you might find relevant, right? But I still think that being explicit about it, especially at the start of the interview, is definitely not a requirement. After you have the working solution, then go nuts, like flex your muscles and show everything that you know about it, right? But I would say it's premature optimization to try to do that at the start of your interview, other than just saying, well, this is a distributed system. I am aware I'll have multiple instances of all of that. Maybe I'll compute the number later, right? But yes.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Good one.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I would just say that in my particular case, again, if I don't need to scale it, it's just too easy. So I was looking for something to begin unrolling the conversation. And thankfully, Mike mentioned scale. And also, so my objective is primarily to help you guys. I'm assuming you're the target audience, and I'm assuming I can help you be better at interviews. So I'm fully aware that real life designs and interview design are different. And at this point, I was hoping to open enough doors to something that might make you think about how could you approach this differently if you're asked this interview question tomorrow. So scale was just a good entry point here.
I have a theory. I want either Bruno or Dima to try to prove me wrong. So junior engineers, or let's just say people below senior, don't hand wave things enough in interviews. They fall into rabbit holes. They waste precious interview time, whereas senior candidates are more likely to hand wave stuff. If I had a ticker for every time Bruno or Dima hand wave something today, it would have been over 10. Like, do people just need to, if you're new to it, you just need to hand wave more stuff more often, just as a general exercise to get your time management down?
Yeah. So I'll give it a go, because like this is actually some recommendation that I give like to people that I interview, right? And I have a very good example of this. Like every single engineer that I interviewed, especially again, not like junior engineers or engineers that are not senior or above, they have this almost obsession with like doing ballpark computations. Like they lots of them go in and they have a bullet list ready of things that they want to talk about, right? And like ballpark computations is one of that. But the way that they go about it when they use this bullet list, they do like functional requirement, clarifying questions, functional requirements, non-functional requirements, and then the ballpark computation, right? Why is that a problem? It is a problem because any ballpark computation that you do, that you turn out not using on your design, it's useless. You're wasting time. Like you're literally wasting time, and that time is like probably the most precious thing that you have during your interview, right? Because it is limited and you have no control over that. Like it will end at some point. So you need to try to avoid that, right? So what I tell my people that I interview is just that. So you should do ballpark computation, especially when you're dealing with some specific aspect of the system that needs that to make a correct design decision. But you should only do ballpark computations for things that are going to have an effect, right? One quick example here. Oh, let's assume I'm uploading video files, multi-gigabyte files, right? Yes, let me compute the latency of this, like the latency in the sense, the latency of connecting, right? Like the answer from the server. So it's almost completely irrelevant because like it might take like 1 minute of latency, let's say, to give you an answer, and it will take like 1 hour to upload the file, right? So the main point is that, of course, you should answer quickly to the user, but you can always fake that. You can say the request and say processing, and then like, okay, it's processing, I'm waiting that, right? And the entire processing time will be 1 hour and 1 minute. That 1 minute of latency during the request is completely irrelevant. Like you might lose some time computing that, but it's not relevant for your design because there is something that dominates, right? So yeah, I do feel that hand waving things is definitely a good strategy, especially when you're not sure about what you want to do. Like I always do that. I did that several times. So yeah, so this thing, I probably need to go like deeper on this one, but I'm not talking about it right now because like we need to think what will happen with the design before we go back to this, right? And that is great because a lot of times you are never going back. Like you're just going like to go to power through it, right? But if needed, your interviewer will just say, yeah, well, remember that thing there? Yes, I want to talk about that. And then you go and talk about it, right? So yeah.
You're protecting yourself. It's a deterrent from having them needing to go there. If they want to go there, they'll take it there. That's great.
Exactly. It's the same thing. Like it's tangentially related. I just want to mention that. But like when some interviewer, like I ask them, do X, and then they go and say something like, oh, we could potentially also do Y, Z, W, and all that. That's all fine. But then I might ask them, okay, now show me how you would do all of that. So you're basically giving yourself more work, and that is not a sound strategy on an interview, right? It's very good that you know this stuff. It's very good that you are able to even go over all of that stuff. But if you think about an actual interview, you should not make an effort to give you more work because you already had enough work even without doing that, right? But yeah, so again, hand wave things instead of increasing the amount of work that you need to do. Yeah.
I've got a question tangential to this for both Dima and Bruno. And it revolves around the idea of kind of what I said, where it's like sometimes you say something and it's clear you know so much about the topic to where we don't need to dive into it. Like, again, CRDT is a great example. At what point do you think it's a bad thing to showcase that you know more than you do? As a more junior engineer than either of you two, for instance, I could say, oh, CRDT, I know that's a good solution here, but I've never actually used those concurrent like data structures. So at what point should you say, oh yeah, not a big deal, you just use CRDT, and then like have to face the backlash of them like saying, oh great, how does that work? So like at what point should you hand wave things that you don't know a lot about versus, you know, kind of dive into them? Like, does that kind of make sense?
I have a controversial opinion here. Can I try to phrase it and you guys tell me where I'm wrong?
Yeah.
I actually feel, so this mantra of fake it till you make it, that's usually a good one. But I think at learning when to hand wave stuff, it actually can backfire. I mean, I would take it to the extreme. I would say that knowing where to hand wave, that's exactly the skill you need to learn through sweat. That's not something you can trick yourself into. So instead of thinking whether I should do it or not, take it from the other angle. You will only learn it through practice, and you can reward yourself that you've learned something, that you understand something really well, when you yourself feel it's good enough to hand wave over something. But if you try to fake it, any good interviewer would ambush you.
So you actually wouldn't recommend hand waving anything that you can't talk about in detail?
That's a strong statement, but I mean,
I'm not going to be able to hand wave anything.
I think it's far better to follow James. It's really far better to say, hey, I'm not entirely positive how this works, but I have a good instinct that this idea would fit well here. So that if the interviewer decides to go there, it's going to be an even grounds conversation, where if you reinvent stuff from scratch with a couple of mistakes, it's still a plus for you. Because if you try to hand wave something that happens to be a huge issue, and then you throw yourself down this rabbit hole, it's going to be a negative sign for you. So why would you, if you have a cheap way to avoid this pitfall, why would you try to fake it so that if this rabbit hole is open, you're screwed? Yeah, I guess yeah. Damage control, risk reward. That's probably a good way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to mention that like I understand where you're coming from, but there is also a risk on not hand waving things. Mostly, like hand waving might be a strategy. Like basically, you are not sure you really understand how things should do, and like you can potentially just hand wave it and move on. It is like it might fall into a trap because your interviewer might not take that, right? They might just say, "Hey, no, wait, I actually want to hear about that." And this is the other point that I have. Like, it is the responsibility of the interviewer up to a point to make sure that whatever information they need to be able to fairly evaluate the candidate would be present on the interview, right? So if the candidate like tries to hand wave something that is important, right, I don't think that it would be like a total failure, because then the interviewer should technically just say, hey, wait, but I actually want to hear about this. So can you go into like, can you give me an explanation of this thing? So in a way, I think the scenario where it could actually hurt, like it will hurt a bit, right? Like because you are not proactive, right? You waited from a prompt from your interviewer to go there, but it wouldn't be like a deal breaker as long as you can then go over and explain whatever the interviewer wants to say, right? It's just like I'm not saying you are wrong. That's not the point that I'm trying to make here. I guess I kind of agree with you that in a way it depends on exactly what you're trying to do. And that will vary from like interview to interview, from question to question, even from like interviewer to interviewer, right? One interviewer might accept this hand waving, the other one might just say, yeah, not so fast, and then force you to go through the thing. But yeah.
I just want to highlight that knowing what to hand wave and what to not hand wave is too close to the actual skill of being able to design systems. So you can't just trick yourself into learning that.
And
Could I propose or like throw something out for thought? It kind of what I'm hearing of the hand waving and not hand waving, then I'm like, oh, what's the definition of hand waving? And what's the difference between like kind of crusting a layer of abstraction over something versus like going and reading the docs and wondering like, how do you install that thing? Or how do you set that machine up? So maybe there could be like I'm going to throw out the contract trick now. Maybe you and your interviewer have a contract where if you can try to move as quickly as possible, and then like it's a little on them and a little on you to try to like leave doors open for them to walk through. So what I'm hearing about hand waving is like you're walking down the hallway and there's a bunch of doors and you're like, there's a door here, we could walk through it, we could not. There's another door here, we could walk through it or not. And then eventually like they'll probably find the right one. And the way that you handle the door that they want to walk down will then be like abstracted into how they would assume you'd handle all of the doors. Does that seem reasonable?
I mean, honestly, I would go as far as saying that if we walk into this hall and there are 20 doors, if I can see the candidate is immediately showing me the 3 doors that are the most interesting parts, the most interesting ones, I can already say they mostly passed the interview. But I guess I'm right on the same horse. So yeah, basically, I guess the action advice here would be that as a candidate, your job, if you don't know which doors to open, is to very gently ask for a hint as for in which direction should you look, so that the interviewer helps you have a good conversation. Like in a way, I was lost in the beginning of this interview, and I asked Mike to navigate. I was exactly like I was totally lost, and I was asking for directional help. In which areas should I probe? I guess I'm not sure I did it well enough, but it's certainly an example of how you could do it and get away with that.
I don't remember you asking for help though.
See, I've done it well then.
I know, but how did you ask for a hint without asking for a hint?
Well, wait, I did ask for hints. I did ask for hints on direction. Every single time I said something like, hey, I'm kind of lost because this looks simple to me and this can be done, that was pretty much begging to give me the sense of direction.
Yeah,
I mean, at least
I'm lost. You were saying this is simple. I don't know. Mike, you've even talked about this in one of your past workshops, like asking for a hint without asking for a hint. This is like trying to think of the way that you taught it, but
yeah, basically don't use the word hint. I think some interviewers are fine with it, but some interviewers actually just really hate the word hint. But the idea is to make a conversation between 2 interviewers. It's like, hey, we're 2 smart people working out a problem, not you know the answer and everything, and you are and I'm just like trying to do your bidding. It's more like make it an equal conversation where it's like, well, I think maybe containerization makes sense here. Something kind of like a Docker. I could go into that in more detail, but maybe there's some other strategy. Or maybe I could use like snapshots and maybe I could order them in the queue or store the data separately. Do you have kind of a direction in mind? Like, what do you think? And kind of spinning it back on the interviewer is helpful. It's like looking for direction. And if you go back and you look at Dima or Bruno, both of them asked for direction in some things. And there were a lot of places Dima was going to go, just even with the initial requirement gathering, for instance, that just, we didn't need to cover. So I was just like, don't care, knocking off things that don't matter, which is great.
Dima, you had mentioned, you'd said a couple of times that you were, you said it in kind of a joking, not a joking way, but a little bit of a self-deprecating way. And in my mind, you're basically like God of software development. So, yeah. So it's hard for me to like take that seriously. But you mentioned that you were stressed a couple of times, or like you felt a little bit of anxiety. Can you, 1, speak a little bit about that, just because I believe you, and yet I don't. And then 2, how someone who doesn't read themselves as godlike in their abilities, how, do you think it's appropriate to just say like, hey, I feel a little bit of stress, even as you're like questing off into like the systems design interview or something like that? Like you're basically signaling vulnerability and weakness, which is a very strong thing to do if you're strong, but if it, like that can also go the wrong way. It feels like that can go the wrong way. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. And also Bruno, maybe you felt that and didn't say that. Maybe Dima is because you went second, so you felt like you had to, there's some dynamic there that Bruno didn't experience. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts.
look, it's flattering, but it really rubs me the wrong way. I was not trying to buy myself any credits and I don't think of myself as someone who understands things really well. And I totally was stressed. I mean, I know for a fact that for the past 2 hours, I was almost late twice today. It's a terrible day. I used the restroom 3 times while Bruno was doing his part. I mean, I have physical anxiety right now. It's better than an hour ago, but I do. So no kidding. And yeah, honestly, I sincerely believe I could have done a lot better compared to how I did. And I'm not happy with my performance. I mean, I deliberately, I'm not sure how to phrase it because you guys seem to take what I say as if I'm trying to buy myself something. I'm totally sincere and honest here. I actually wanted to be like, I kind of wanted to suck today because I think it's going to create better content for us. It's more interesting for you guys to watch me struggle and to watch Mike navigate me and to watch us argue with Bruno. So I'm happy it turned out this way, but it's totally not as planned. It's just I really, really was anxious during this conversation. And a couple of times I was like paralyzed. If we watch the recording closely, which I will later, a couple of moments I actually felt like I have no idea what to say next. I lost the train of thought. I know there are a couple of loose ends to tie, and I can't recall which one was the most important one from 30 seconds ago. I had this at least twice today. I was literally paralyzed. If it doesn't show, that's a big testimony, thank you, but I honestly don't think of myself as anywhere near being able to handle this smoothly.
Do you have any tips, either Bruno or Dima, for that, like the anxiety that we all are kind of facing? Like, what would you say somebody's about to go into their dream job interview and they're terrified? What do you say to them?
So I would give that a go because this is something that I clearly remember, even if it was like 16 years ago. So I used to work for a German company. I was working out of Brazil. I working with operating systems. I was writing kernels, right? And which is like was very uncommon, especially at the time, right? These days everybody's doing an operating system, but yeah. So the company started going really, really badly because it was trying to compete with like Apple and Microsoft, and then it was pretty clear that I would lose my job simply because the company would not exist anymore, right? So I decided to search for a job, and I went to search for a new job in Google, right? And then Google has the jobs at Google link, so I clicked on that. They just opened an office in Brazil, right? And so I applied. Well, what the hell? I have nothing to lose, right? So I went through the interview process, which we all know the Google interview process is like, it's not a very good example of good interview process in my personal opinion, but still, I was hired. At some point, I got an offer. Like for the next 5 days, entire week, basically, I would wake up in the morning and say, "What? I was hired by Google. How? Like what? Like how can this like this is Google 16 years ago? That was probably the best Google ever, like that existed, right? So even for me, it was difficult to accept that. I have to say that it's like it is. I'm not a shy person. In fact, as a software engineer, I'm probably the complete opposite of that. So I was interviewed by Ars Technica at some point in time, right? And then the interviewer talking to me, right, like about the operating system that I was writing and all that. Like he went to me and said, you know who you remind me? I said, who? Like Steve Jobs. So why? Am I a billionaire and I don't know about that? I said, no, because you're able to convince an elephant that they are an ant. Basically, he was saying that was a very persuasive. And the reason I mentioned that is exactly because interviews are very different for shy people and for like people that are not shy at all, right? And interviewers should account to that. But sometimes it is difficult. Sometimes people come to an interview, they have a lot of difficulty in moving forward because they are afraid of making errors. That seems like that is clear to me, the main problem here, because they think like, no, it's a Google interview, right? Or whatever big company. If I make an error, I'm out, right? There is no way. So I can't make an error. It's like, take that out of your mind. I think that would be the most like it is okay to make errors. Like a system, you should, especially system design interview, you should handle that as a conversation with a peer. So it's a discussion. If you don't know something, you literally go and say, hey, I was thinking about doing this, but I'm not sure this is the best option for that, right? Like what do you think? Like this is a direction that makes sense in this context or not? Like your interviewer might actually discuss that with you, and like we'll give you a hint, right, in a way or another, or they will just literally like not even consider that a hint. They will just like consider that a part of the conversation, and they will tell you whatever you need in that context to move forward, with hopefully without telling you exactly what to do, because that is bad during the interview, right? But the main point is that do not be afraid of saying the wrong thing, right? Like it is very easy to get in that state. Once you get into that state, it's very difficult to get out. So it is a normal person that is interviewing, right? It might be a very an engineer with a lot of experience. It's still an engineer. They will make errors. Like I made errors here today. Like Dima made errors here today, right? Like that is normal thing. Like in those companies, there will never be a single person designing a system. There will be lots of people where you can throw back and forth, and then you throw an idea and someone goes, yeah, that won't work at all. Like try something else, right? So you should have the same mentality. Do not be afraid of like making errors, right? Just go there and do your best, right? And I think that is the best that one can do, is get to the interview with the mentality that they are going to have a conversation, and the result of that conversation it is an important one, right? But it's also not the end of the world. If you usually don't pass, you can try again at another point in time. But yeah. I hope I covered what you asked.
What always helps me, there's awesome story. What always helps me is just to keep in mind that interviews are effectively a repetition of the real job. And in real job, once we work together, there will be moments where one of us is totally down, or after a hangover or whatever. And we should still be able to work together long-term sustainably. So if I feel I got the dump when I'm talking to my interviewer, I know they will forgive me as long as I'm reasonably perfect. I need to show them the skill of recovering from it emotionally within the next 30 seconds and going through this question together. That's so like, there's no need to fret about it. Honestly, it's normal. That's human nature, right? So once you become less embarrassed about this, it kind of gets easier over time.
I think that's hard because so often I think interviews aren't a reflection of the job, especially the data structures and algorithms are a great example. When was the last time you needed binary search actually to solve a problem? Not that it can't be. I've written a depth first search for Google code bases to do things, but like it's not common. So I think system design maybe is better just because you have that ability to kind of interact, and like, again, bringing them down to your level and talking with them kind of makes sense. But still, sometimes like it's just stressful. It's like do math in your head or something like that. It's just stress inducing. But yeah, makes sense. I appreciate that.
I just want to point out that it's what you mentioned is still true for system design, but in a smaller scale, I would say, because system design is it tends to be open-ended, right? There is a specific direction that your interviewer expects you to take, because again, we should know the ins and outs of the question that we are asking. But other than that, like you might come up with like good different ways, especially when there are obvious trade-offs, right? You can pick A or B, as long as you justify why you pick one or the other. Probably either is fine, right? As long as you have a good justification, right? And that is a reasonable one at least, right? So generally speaking, for system design, there is less of this completely different. Of course, like, yeah, no one will ask you to like design this entire product by yourself and like, with only telling me how to, like, you tell me how to do that in an actual job, right? You have a team, you have other people working with you, right? But yes, system design is a bit less strict than less different than the coding interviews, but yeah.
At this point, I always tell my favorite joke, which kind of helps as a motivator. The joke is when some scientists, some geologists, I think, wanted to do some research in Alaska, and it was such a rural place that it's hard to reach that they hired the local native Alaskan to take the guy there. And at some point, they found a grizzly bear running towards them. And this local native guy, what he started to do is started to put his skis on. And the joke is like, hey, come on, these bears can run like 80 miles per hour. Do you really plan to outrun a bear? Oh, I don't need to outrun a bear. I need to outrun you. So you never compare yourself to the perfect candidate passing the interview. You compare yourself to other people whom this particular interviewer is trying to interview with their imperfect style, etc., etc. Moreover, if honestly, I think if you are unlucky enough to stumble upon the interviewer who always gives a no hire signal, you're actually lucky, because the bar for the hiring committee to ignore the no from this person for you is quite low. Like, if the person says no to everybody, but for you the feedback reads that, hey, this person actually said something clever once or twice. That's all you need. I mean, I'm not sure if it qualifies for a mental trick, but it works for me. You only need to be good enough compared to other people who are in your shoes.